Tsunade vs Kakashi is a pretty interesting discussion that's kind of flown under the radar for a lot of people. I hardly ever see it discussed outside of the occasional Hokage ranking, even though it's a pretty interesting topic. What with Kakashi losing Kamui and some of the other abilities he had in the war, a lot of people view him as massively weaker, and with Tsunade, who's pretty much always been seen as kind of lackluster when compared to the other Kage, I thought it would be an interesting topic to see who's now the weakest Hokage. But before getting into actual scaling and feats, there's a pretty common misconception a lot of people have from Kakashi's novel. In Kakashi Retsuden, it states that he's far stronger than he was in the war. The only issue is this novel takes place during the Boruto era rather than as Kakashi was Hokage. Along with the previous statement taking place in the Boruto era, as Hokage, Kakashi was suffering from a kind of mental handicap due to the loss of his lightning blade, so it's extremely likely that he's weaker than he was in the war. This mental handicap may have had a hand in his reaction to the meteor in Naruto the Last, which is used quite a bit to downplay him as Hokage. I find Kakashi as Hokage far harder to scale than Tsunade because in his novel Kakashi Hiden, he really only has 3 good feats to use when scaling him, and 2 of them require a bit of speculation. This wouldn't make them invalid or anything, but it makes them a lot more subject to debate. Without further ado, however, I can get into the feats in question. The first main one is briefly taking on Base Lee in a taijutsu match. Albeit this wasn't really an all-out battle for either one, but Kakashi's performance was considerably better than Lee. He basically knocks out Lee in like 5 moves. So I don't think there would be much issue saying Kakashi scales above Base Lee. However, this version of Lee doesn't have a ton of feats, but it's not super wild to assume he got at least marginally stronger than he was in the war. During the war, he could blatantly outspeed Madara's truth-seeking orbs, which based on Naruto and Sasuke's final battle, arguments can be made that they scale to the user's speed. This may potentially pose a consistency issue, however Kakashi in the war has arguable feats that scale him to 6-path Sage Mode Naruto in reaction speed, so you can take that as you will. Even if you don't want to go with this higher tier scaling, War Art Kakashi is shown reacting to the same truth-seeking orbs, so you can use that scaling to say Hokage Kakashi may be potentially relative to his strength in the war, and he only surpassed that level of strength in Kakashi Retsuden. The only issue is this was both gated Lee and resolve amped Lee, which is shown and stated to have a massive effect in power. So you would have to assume the growth Lee was subject to completely eclipsed both of these massive amps, which is kind of faulty. But you can also make the argument that Lee would scale somewhere around the level of base Might Guy, who should be somewhat relative to base War Art Kakashi. Kakashi's second main feat is fighting with Kaio and absolutely dominating her in taijutsu, even after being massively suppressed and fatigued. Their short fight wasn't even close. Kakashi was moving fast enough to create casual after images which scale above the perceiver, while fighting with absolutely no intent to kill, as he himself states. You can argue Kaio scales above a clone of Naruto, seeing as Kaio was able to dodge kunai from Naruto and then appear directly behind Naruto. It's even stated what was worse, before Naruto knew it, that very ninja had taken up a position behind him. This implies 2 things. For one, that Kaio used her own speed to get behind him, as it's stated she had taken up a position behind him, which implies some form of movement, and second, that Naruto didn't realize Kaio had taken that position. While this was a clone of Naruto, it would be hard to scale because it's mentioned that Naruto creates clones beforehand. However, it's not mentioned how many, so this clone could range from 20% of Naruto's chakra all the way to like 5 or even higher. But Even if we assume that this was just a tiny amount of Naruto's chakra, considering the feats that base Naruto has, this even suppressed version of Naruto's clone should scale massively above the majority of shinobi. Regardless of specifics, it's still quite impressive that, depending heavily on your interpretation, could be used to scale Kakashi extremely high. But ignoring the scaling of Naruto's clone, Kaiô is able to completely perception blitz the Raikage, and it's pretty apparent that she wasn't going all out, as this was a training bout compared to the Raikage, who had absolutely no reason to suppress his perception. You can argue this Raikage scales above his War Arc self, as it's literally shown he trains in his free time. The Raikage, who in a previous form, and likely weaker form, was compared to Minato in the data books, and directly stated to be above Tsunade in speed. Though the Minato argument differs depending on if you want to say it was during his time as Hokage or when he was a Jonin, but that's not really relevant because based on the Madara statement it still puts Kakashi above Tsunade in speed, likely by a significant amount. Kakashi's last feat in the novel is easily his most impressive, arguably his most noticeably destructive feat ever, excluding DMS. In the novel, he's able to create a thunderstorm with rain and everything while both fatigued and injured. This storm even created lightning bolts with enough force to completely split large trees in half. However, it is mentioned that there were clouds before Kakashi formed the storm. However, Kakashi is the one who made them form rain, lightning, and so on, so it shouldn't completely invalidate the feat. Even the energy outputted of an average thunderstorm is around equal to that of a 20 kiloton nuclear explosion, which would translate to an attack that could destroy large towns and small cities with ease. The thing is that the thunderstorm Kakashi produced was anything but average. As I previously mentioned, it had enough force to completely split large trees in half, and it was powerful enough that Inoki deemed it impressive. However, the energy outputted by a thunderstorm isn't dispersed instantly. It takes place over a period of time. However, we know Kakashi's storm took a long period to disperse, as it stated the rain had finally stopped. Finally, by definition, means a long period of time. However, this feat should scale leagues above a 20 kiloton explosion, as in part 1 Kakashi was able to both summon and disperse a storm which was calculated to be around small country level. In part 1 we know the maximum amount of lightning blades before Kakashi was fatigued was around 4. In the War Arc, Kakashi showed easily double that amount what was spamming Kamui and Lightning Blade. So in the war, Kakashi should have easily double, possibly even triple the amount of chakra he had in part 1, and that's a low ball. As Hokage, Kakashi no longer has the Sharingan strain, so he should have far more chakra than he had in the war. So, since we know Kakashi was putting all of the chakra he had available into the jutsu, and the energy output of a storm depends on if it's average or above average, as I've already mentioned it clearly was, the jutsu that Kakashi performed in his novel should be easily country level, possibly even higher. So Hokage Kakashi should be able to output purple lightning of a similar scale to a nuclear bomb, or an inverse example would be like something like a Biju bomb. And keep in mind this Kakashi was not anywhere near close to peak condition. His fingers were broken, he was exhausted from constantly molding his chakra to prevent Kaiô's ice chains from freezing him to death, and along with that he had used multiple smaller scale versions of purple lightning, all without rest. These same smaller scale purple lightnings were able to vaporize Kaiô's ice swords, and when met with a variant of Kaiô's ice style, the explosion produced was able to shake the entire airship they were on. So a prime condition Kakashi may be able to launch off multiple of these Biju bomb level purple lightnings, or maybe even stronger forms of it before getting exhausted, which should be more than enough to take out most opponents. Moving on to Tsunade's best feats, her most impressive is shattering Madara's imperfect Susanoo and taking down a few of his clones. The only issue is these feats, while impressive, Madara wasn't exactly going all out, and along with the fact that she needed assistance from the Raikage to fully shatter it. It doesn't really help her case that Kakashi is shown to be leagues faster than the Raikage, who Madara stated Tsunade was slower than. You can assume that the speed gap isn't massive because Tsunade was pretty confident about taking down the Raikage, but that could simply mean that he isn't massively faster than her. So even if we assume they're somewhat relative in speed with the Raikage having the advantage, that still puts both Kaio and Kakashi more than a blitz tier above both of them. Even if you made the incorrect assumption that Tsunade may have attacks of similar scale to pre-Kaguya War Arc Sakura, that wouldn't matter because Kakashi with Purple Lightning, as I've already shown, should have better destructive power, or at the minimum better attack potency, along with the fact that Tsunade is far too slow to land a hit on him. I didn't go too far into Katsuyu because, assuming Tsunade summons before Kakashi attempts to end the fight, Katsuyu wouldn't pose much of a threat to him since he can block any offensive attempts from her with a chakra enhanced mud wall or something like that, or he can just simply dodge them. This battle would be leagues more fair if Tsunade was closer to Kakashi in speed, because at least then there would be the potential to land a hit on him. But with how Kakashi fights and his use of clones and the substitution jutsu, even with equal stats I highly doubt Tsunade could land a hit on Kakashi. Kakashi at this point should have scaling around the level of KCM2 Naruto in speed, while it's still slower than his War Arc self who has feats relative to KCM Minato. However, having speed relative or above KCM2 Naruto should be more than fast enough to outclass Tsunade. Pretty much the only advantage Tsunade has is with her 100 healings. Even with equal stats, it's not too far-fetched to assume Kakashi could just clone, feint, and bisect her without much difficulty, since he's been shown the ability to do that with much larger appendages from Nui. While both Kakashi and Tsunade are extremely strong fighters and most definitely Kage level shinobi, Kakashi should win this fight without much difficulty. He pretty much outclasses her in every area, including raw strength, which is usually her trump card against most opponents. There weren't a ton of feats I could use to effectively compare Tsunade to Kakashi, but either way I hope I did each character justice.